Hello. So in this video we're going to talk about Hesiod, the ancient Greek poet who wrote Theogony and Works and Days, which were two of the most important foundational poems of ancient Greek religion and sort of early ethics. But they're also incredibly important because Theogony tells us a lot about Greek mythology, and Works and Days tells us a lot about Greek material culture. So these are remarkably important poems. So in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about Hesiod himself, and then some of the key characteristics of the way that he looks at the world. So Hesiod, we don't know exactly when he was born. There's I think a general consensus, much more a general consensus, that Hesiod was a real person than that Homer was a real person. But Homer and Hesiod are the two sort of most important early Greek poets. According to the introduction in this lovely Oxford World Classics edition, Hesiod was active as a writer in the last third of the 8th century BCE. So, late 700s or so? Maybe like 730 to 700 BCE? Somewhere around there. We're not exactly sure, because as with most ancient works, there are no sort of original manuscripts with a clear date on them saying, Hesiod wrote this in 715 BCE, or whatever it is. But one of the reasons that that's really significant, as the Oxford editors point out, is that in the 8th century, the region that would become Greece was in tremendous cultural contact with the Middle East, with Egypt, as far away as Persia, and maybe even Indian civilizations. And so they were taking in a tremendous amount of cultural material, as well as technology, new ideas, etc., etc. And actually, the classicist Edith Hall, in her book, I think it's called Introducing the Greeks, she actually argues that the reason that the Greeks were such an amazing civilization was not because they came up with a bunch of stuff on their own, but because they took a bunch of stuff from other civilizations they encountered through trade, and they combined those things in unique ways. And we can see this actually in Hesiod's work. So in Theogony, for instance, scholars have now traced influences of Middle Eastern civilizations, Near Eastern civilizations. So I'd read this quote in my video on Theogony, but I'm going to read it again because I think it's worth noting, especially since we still have this pervasive cultural myth that the Greeks sort of developed in isolation, that they were geniuses because they as a civilization were great. So the editors here say, we now know that it was not the process. This is talking about the sort of violence and the overthrowing of generations in the Theogony. We now know that it was not the product of Hesiod's savage fancy, but a Hellenized version of an Oriental myth, other versions of which are represented in a Hittite text of the 13th century BC, or a Babylonian poem of the 11th, called Emua Elish. And I said this before, I don't speak Babylonian, so I don't know if that's correct pronunciation, sometimes called the Epic of Creation. We cannot say where or how it was first taken over by Greeks, but it seems to have made its way to Hesiod via Crete, where Zeus's birth is placed, and Delphi, where the stone that Kronos swallowed instead of Zeus was exhibited. So basically, the Greeks were getting these influences from the Hittites, who lived in what's now Turkey, from the Babylonians in what's now Iraq, from Egypt, obviously in what's now Egypt, what's still Egypt, these other Near Eastern civilizations, like the Phoenicians, from who the Greeks got writing, and the Greeks added vowels. The Phoenicians just had consonants in their alphabet, but the Greeks added vowels. So that's actually where the Greeks got the technology of writing. Similarly, with Works and Days, we can see these Eastern influences, these African influences. They point out, for instance, that the last maybe quarter of Hesiod's Works and Days is devoted to the question, well, actually the last maybe fifth is devoted to the question of which days within particular months are lucky or proper to plant things on and to harvest things on. And it right, I've lost the bit where the editors talk about that, but that's something that you get in the cosmology of a lot of Near Eastern civilizations. The Persians, the Babylonians, people like this were all really interested in astrology as a way of sort of guiding when a particular enterprise would be profitable or not. They also talk about Works and Days as a moral didactic poem, and a tradition that these editors link to the Sumerians, Babylonians, Hebrews, and Egyptians, all of whom wrote wisdom literature, this sort of moral advice literature. Similarly, animal fables seem to have developed in the Middle East, and then come to Greece later on. So Hesiod is very clearly working in these traditions of Hellenized or domesticated, from the Greek perspective, styles of literature that were very common in the Middle East and in Egypt. So he shows us these really interesting cultural developments, cultural hybridity, as post-colonial theorists like Homi Bhabha would call it. So Hesiod himself, one of the things that we know about him, and I put "know" in scare quotes because he puts it in the poem Works and Days, so it's probably fairly accurate, but it's not 100% sure. We know that he was raised in a farming community, and actually all of the advice that he gives about farming in Works and Days supports this idea. But he says, as my father and yours, foolish Perseus, used to sail in ships in want of fair livelihood, and one day he came here making the long crossing from Aeolian Kyme in his dark ship, not running from riches nor from wealth and prosperity, but from evil poverty which Zeus dispenses to men. And he settled near Helicon in a miserable village, Askra, bad in winter, foul in summer, good at no time. So we have a sense of where Hesiod has come from, where his family is from, and where he was raised. That he was raised in this sort of not particularly abundant farming region, and that he himself grew up with experience farming, that he grew up with experience tending flocks and things like this. And that's actually a crucial point at the beginning of Theogony, because almost the first thing that he says in this poem, and I talked about this in my video on Theogony, is his sort of origin story as a poet, which is that he was out tending his sheep and the muses came to him and basically said, we're going to give you the gift of song. We're going to give you the gift of poetry so that we will speak through you. We will tell divine truths that mortals otherwise wouldn't have access to through you. And so Hesiod actually talks about that a number of times. in Works and Days, for instance, there's a passing reference where he says, basically, I don't know anything about sailing, but the muses have given me knowledge beyond what I actually know, so I'm going to tell you about sailing. So this is one of the things that Hesiod does, and this then becomes a sort of major stylistic technique used by Greek poets later on, Greek epic poets. This idea that the muses will inspire me to speak the truth beyond what I as a mortal could know. So that's great, in a way, I guess. So another thing that characterizes Hesiod's work, another thing that characterizes his worldview, is the idea of progress, the idea of teleological or historical movement. So this is central to theogony, in which you have a series of generations of deities. So you have the original chthonic earth gods, earth and heaven in the English translation. That's Gaia is earth, Uranus is heaven. Thanks to someone on my YouTube channel for reminding me of that, since I blanked on the name in my video on theogony. So you had that original grouping, that original generation. They get supplanted by the Titans, led by Kronos. And then Kronos and the Titans get supplanted by the Olympians, led by Zeus. So there's this idea that time progresses in a linear fashion. Similarly, in Works and Days, I talked about this in my video on that poem, you have this idea of progress through the ages of men, or the ages of, really, the universe, I guess. Starting with the Golden Age, where the gods were living in sort of glorious luxuriance and not working hardness. Then you go to the Silver Age, then you go to the Bronze Age, then the Heroic Age, and then the Iron Age, in which Hesiod himself lives, and we still live today, unfortunately. So there's, again, this idea that the universe moves forward in a specific, recognizable direction. And the other thing, and I want to talk about with Hesiod in general, I talked about this in both of my other videos, but he is deeply misogynistic. It is very much a problem for contemporary readers, but it probably reflected common ideas in 8th century BCE Greece. In both Theogony and Works and Days, he has these negative portrayals of women, the most extended of which is his description of the creation of Pandora, from whom all women descend, in Works and Days. So I read the first bit of this in the video on Works and Days, but I want to read the rest of it. So basically, we start with Zeus talking to Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, and so Zeus decides to punish both Prometheus and human beings. He says, "Son of Iapetos, clever above all others, you are pleased at having stolen fire and outwitted me. A great calamity both for yourself and for men to come. To set against the fire I shall give them an affliction in which they will all delight as they embrace their own misfortune." That's women. That's how he characterizes women. So saying, the father of gods and men laughed aloud, and he told renowned Hephaestus at once to mix earth with water, to add in a human voice and strength, and to model up upon the immortal goddess's aspect the fair lovely form of a maiden. Athena he told to teach her crafts, to weave the embroidered web, and golden Aphrodite to shower charm upon her head, and painful yearning and consuming obsession. To put in a bitch's mind and a knavish nature, that was his instruction to Hermes the go-between, the dog-killer. So he ordered, and they all obeyed the Lord Zeus, son of Kronos. At once the renowned ambidexter molded from earth the likeness of a modest maiden by Kronos' son's design, and the pale-eyed goddess Athena dressed and adorned her. The Graces and the Lady Temptation put necklaces of gold about her body, and the lovely-haired spirits of ripeness garlanded her about with spring flowers. Pallas Athena arranged all the adornment on her body. In her breast the go-between, the dog-killer, fashioned lies and wily pretenses and a knavish nature by deep thundering Zeus's design. And he put in a voice to the herald of the gods, and he named this woman Pandora, all gift, because all the dwellers on Olympus made her their gift, a calamity for men who live by bread. When he had completed the precipitous, unmanageable trap, which again is a description of woman, the father sent the renowned dog-killer to Epimetheus. That's Prometheus's somewhat dim-witted brother. The father sent the renowned dog-killer to Epimetheus, taking the gift, swift messenger of the gods. Epimetheus Epimetheus gave no thought to what Prometheus had told him, never to accept a gift from Olympian Zeus, but to send it back lest some affliction befall mortals. He accepted and had the bane before he realized it. For formerly the tribes of men on earth lived remote from ills, without harsh toil and the grievous sickness that are deadly to men. But the woman unstopped the jar and let it all out, and brought grim cares upon mankind. Only hope remained there inside her secure dwelling, under the lip of the jar, and did not fly out, because the woman put the lid back in time by the providence of Zeus, the cloud-gatherer who bears the aegis. But for the rest, countless troubles roam among men. Full of ills is the earth, and full the sea. Sicknesses visit men by day, and others by night, uninvited, bringing ill to mortals silently, because Zeus the resourceful deprived them of voice. Thus there is no way to evade the purpose of Zeus. So again, Pandora, the first woman, is presented as an evil that unleashes all of these illnesses and troubles upon mankind rather than humanity necessarily, but and she does this basically because she was designed by the gods to be a punishment for human beings. So like the story of Eve in Christian and Jewish theology, this is a very anti-woman perspective. This idea that woman is fundamentally evil, she's the bringer of evils, and that she was created effectively by the gods as a punishment that men couldn't do without. Incredibly problematic.